He directs projects to establish wildlife highway crossings and coordinates the Borderlands Linkages Initiative, which brings together groups from Arizona and Sonora in the identification and protection of jaguar corridors in the Borderlands. Juan Carlos previously worked for the Mexican conservation group Naturalia, ran the Northern Jaguar Reserve, and collaborated in Mexico's first wolf reintroduction 30 years after their extirpation. He's a native of Mexico City, where he studied graphic communications in the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and now lives in Hermosillo, Sonora, a city in the heart of the Sonoran Desert. And with that, I will turn it over to Juan Carlos Bravo.
Thank you, Steph. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm going to give a presentation on the work we're doing, mostly promoting corridors in the Borderlands region. And these corridors are focused on allowing the movement of wildlife. And of course, there's an emphasis on large carnivores, and there are certain, there's definitely overlap with the interest to protect wolves and their capability to move through the landscape. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about how our work connects with that, and how we are in that way supporting wolves. Our organization is still growing in Mexico, and we'd love to have more capacity to engage in wolf issues. At this point, we're focusing mostly on the issues of connectivity. So I am going to start sharing my screen. Yeah, this should work. I believe you can all see now. And play the slideshow. Okay.
Yep, that looks good. We can see it.
Can you see the chat window floating above it? Is it obnoxious?
Nope. We just
okay.
keep it wide.
Perfect. Then, okay. Oh, and of course it's not running. Oh, there it is. So, as I guess has been discussed at multiple times throughout the previous presentations, reintroduction of wolves began in the United States in '98, in Mexico in 2011, and for the most part, those efforts have been separated. Although, of course, there is coordination between parties. The habitat that Dr. Carlos Lopez was describing as habitat that wolves seem to prefer, at least in Mexico, in the Borderlands area, this kind of rolling hills of grasslands with oak groves here and there. And that kind of landscape is, of course, a continuous landscape from Mexico to the United States. If you were to see the border from this perspective, you would notice that the landscape itself is exactly the same on both countries, and it's of course being separated by the border and the increasingly conflictive border wall, which is being built at a very aggressive rate in the last few months. And so that has been one of the main concerns. Will this affect wolves? Will this affect the viability of not only the populations on either country, but the whole reintroduction program? And so this wall, of course, is being built to stop people. And as anybody with the slightest amount of intelligence can tell you, it's not going to stop anyone. All you need is a big ladder, no matter what. And so what it definitely does achieve is blocking wildlife from moving from one place to another. This is just one of many pictures that a lot of the audience will be familiar with in terms of the effect of the border wall on the movement of wildlife. So how exactly does that relate to the work we do? Well, Wildlands Network was founded in '92, And a lot of our interest is in connectivity. Our founders were some of the first pioneers in the concept of connectivity. When the idea was first thrown about and maps were drawn of major corridors throughout North America, a lot of them were accused of trying to execute land grabs for the United Nations and the deep government and whatnot. And of course, we're now a lot better familiar with landscape connectivity, and people participate in all kinds of stakeholder landscape management efforts throughout the continent. And I think we've been successful in making this less of a fringe issue and more of a mainstream conservation effort. So when we see the wolf habitat in our countries, and of course we are concerned at the scale of the continent, we immediately recognize this from the model that was used by Fish and Wildlife Service, that we've got core patches of habitat in dark blue that are distributed throughout Mexico and the United States. And there is a lot of habitat that's good enough for wolves to move about, which is the lighter blue in this particular map. And the possibility of connecting these two patches and the two populations being reintroduced on both countries and establishing a meta population is, of course, provided by the habitat. And so we certainly have a question here about what are we going to do about it. There are efforts, it is my understanding that there are efforts from the Mexican government to try and get the Fish and Wildlife Service to recognize this as a single population effort, rather than continue attempting to manage them as separate populations. And hopefully those will eventually be successful. It makes sense to us as conservationists to think of wolves being reintroduced on both countries as a single large population that is going to have mostly the necessary genetic flow through individuals moving from one place to another. Do they actually move from one place to another? Well, this is a short animation made with the actual coordinates taken from a collar of a male in early 2017, showing that an animal released in Mexico actually made it all the way to Las Cruces and then back over here in central Mexico. The video loops. The animal did not actually make a perfect loop and made it multiple times to Las Cruces, but it gives you a sense of the capacity for these animals to move through vast landscapes in search of what they need, and to definitely cross the border in search of better alternatives, whether it's north or back south. And a lot of what we try and do is document this in some level of detail that we can inform public opinion, policymakers, and courts actually on what's going on with wolves. So what you saw there in the animation was then, this is what you're seeing here is a zoom of that actual movement of the animal, where it crossed in relation to what kind of border structure. And you can see that this yellow hashed border infrastructure, which is a vehicle barrier, is definitely permeable to wolves. This kind of wall is designed to stop vehicles from crossing the border, but it won't stop a wolf. That's for sure. It might stop other kinds of animals, but wolves are very capable of crossing it. Made it all the way to Las Cruces and then went back and found this very small gap in the pedestrian barrier, which is a lot more impermeable to wolves, to find its way back. This was used in different media once we produced it. Newspapers are usually happy to have these kinds of maps and to reinterpret them most of the times for their audiences. We provide this kind of detailed information in the hopes that there is a better understanding of wolf movements throughout the border. This work is done mostly by our staff in Tucson. We have a Borderlands program coordinator based out of Tucson, and he is tasked with documenting everything that's going on with the border wall and keeping track of every development on the border wall with sufficient technical detail is sometimes quite tasking. There will come out some kind of announcement, and it has to be interpreted in terms of what coordinates does it refer to, what sections of the border wall, what's being built there. And we produce these kinds of maps. This one in particular was produced to inform of the effects of the latest appropriations in terms of their impact to jaguar critical habitat in Arizona and the foothill of New Mexico. And as you can see, there are different sections that are being closed right now this year that were previously open. There's pedestrian fence that is in progress of being built. There are other sorts of other stretches of pedestrian fence that were already built before this map was made. And so we try and keep people informed about these developments, in particular a coalition of over 40 groups, human rights, environmental groups, that oppose the construction of the border wall. And so our organization will not have the clout of groups as the Sierra Club or CBD in terms of getting thousands of people to sign or show up at Congress people's offices, but we provide the scientific information, the technical information that they can use to advocate for the removal of the wall or stopping the construction. We ground truth a lot of that information. What you're seeing here are pictures from the site taken last month, and we also have a drone that is used to survey these areas and obtain information that can be used to better understand. Well, it's mostly violations of all kinds of regulations in terms of how the border wall is built. There are contractors that oftentimes do not respect private lands rights or things like that, and so we try and document as much as we can there to inform the public and to inform stakeholders about these kinds of developments. And our staff person goes as far as to trying to understand the design elements of the border wall and how permeable some of these are. And as you can see, an older style of wall on the left gaps big enough for a lot of animals to crawl underneath. But now these new designs are a lot more effective at keeping animals from moving from one country to the other. This information then we put in different reports. You can see the now governor of New Mexico, when she was a congresswoman, was part of a delegation that was kind enough to receive a fly-in of different advocates against the border wall. We present facts on the actual need of the wall. For example, the apprehensions, how they went down throughout from 2000 to 2007, and we advocate for multiple species when we do this kind of work. It's not all focused on the Mexican wolf. We also inform litigation. There is a very notable 20-state lawsuit against a specific funding appropriation that is meant to support the wall. And in that and other lawsuits, our staff person in Tucson, Malstrap Hagen, has served as an expert witness providing this kind of technical information. And in this particular case, the ruling was in favor of stopping this appropriation, calling the appropriation legal. And what was particularly interesting about this is that it did cite Mexican wolf and the impact of the wall, specifically on Mexican wolf. A lawyer involved in the case told us that the map that you saw were the journal of the wolf with specific dates of when it was moving about was particularly impactful in terms of making the decision. And so in this particular case, the state of New Mexico was claiming the construction of this particular project would interrupt the movement of the Mexican wolf. And this kind of technical information that we help support on behalf of states can have an impact in court, and hopefully, at the very least, slows down the construction of the wall. And we're now focusing on a very specific area of, again, this wolf habitat model, which is an area of opportunity we found where we've got two adjacent protected areas on separate sides of the border. On the north, we have the San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge, managed by and owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And on the south, you have Los Ojos, an area designated voluntarily for conservation. That's what this acronym means. It's a certification by the Mexican federal government, where any private party can request their land to be certified as a conservation area, provided they hand out a management program and justify the environmental merits of their property. And so, with these two protected areas on separate sides of the border, on the corridor that is used by wolves, jaguars, presumably other animals, we wanted to obtain a lot more fine-grained data of what's going on. This is a close-up of those two areas, and as you can see, the San Bernardino River flows right across the border. A major tributary of it also joins it right there. And so it's been a corridor for wildlife, a very important corridor for wildlife, presumably for millennia. And hopefully there is some way to keep it that way. But the latest border wall construction project actually is going to split the San Bernardino River and separate these two protected areas, splitting this natural corridor. And so when we first learned about this, we got in contact with the refuge managers and obtained a permit to take out a drone to the area and start documenting the process of the border wall going up. And the permit also allows us to set up camera traps, and so we're documenting wildlife moving in the in the landscape. Our intent is learning more about what kinds of animals are moving there, and document the impact on all carnivores, on all species. But eventually, you know, if we were to find evidence that specifically wolves or jaguars are being impacted, or any other species in the Endangered Species Act, that's part of what we want to learn. And so we've got 40 cameras distributed, 20 on each side of the border, in collaboration with the managers of Los Ojos and the Fish and Wildlife Service there. And so what we're trying to figure out is, as the wall is being built, how that changes the movement of wildlife. And what we first saw was kind of a peak of movement as the wall was closing in on these refuges, and as it was closing in, wildlife was sort of funneled through the remaining gaps. And now that it's almost over, what we're seeing is, of course, a decrease in wildlife movement in the area. This is still a work in progress, but we're learning a lot, not only about carnivores, but about other species, the prey species that move about the landscape. And I think, of course, we want to know about the prey species. That's one of the great question marks, particularly in Mexico, as regards to wolves and wolf viability. There are, of course, you can see cougars in the area that were still moving from Mexico to the United States and backwards. And so we want to learn. We've got some evidence of how the wall is impacting large carnivores here. Eventually, what we want is, with all this documentation, is for some form of mitigation structures, or or the tearing down of sections of the wall in very discrete parts of the border, which we think is a realistic project. We've seen very much as in the kind of mismanagement that Michael was mentioning. That is a bipartisan mismanagement. We've also seen a bipartisan unwillingness to acknowledge the impact of the border wall, and so we don't expect even the most progressive, realistically progressive Democratic administration to be willing to tear down the whole thing. But hopefully we'll get it to tear down specific sections of the border wall in places such as San Bernardino, where the impacts are clear, documented, and we've got protected areas on both sides. We hope that by identifying these places, we will provide gaps along the border wall in the near future, and eventually build more information so that future generations can tear down the whole thing. The border wall is not the only obstacle for wildlife movement in the area. The Mexico Highway 2 is in some places parallel to the border, and as close as a mile or two from the actual border. So it creates a compound impact on the mobility of wildlife. And as you can see, large canids can be impacted. Actually, coyotes are the species most affected by Highway 2. It is being expanded. It's being widened in Mexico, and so we've been working for the past few years in trying to get the transportation authorities to build wildlife crossings in this particular highway right next to the border. And this is where it lies in relationship to the border. As you can see, at such a scale, it basically is right on the border. We've got corridors mapped for jaguars in this area. We're eager to get Dr. Lopez's newest wolf habitat connectivity models so that we can see where the highway will present a barrier for wolf movement. There have been 2 documented roadkill events in the Mexican reintroduction effort, both of them juveniles, and it is the second cause of man-made mortality for wolves in the U.S. And so we do believe that our work in road ecology has the potential of providing connectivity for wolves eventually. We've got a lot to learn of the specific places where we'll need to implement it, but and exactly how to work with the Mexican government and other stakeholders to make these wildlife crossings be built eventually. But we think that what we're doing is going to be applicable for different portions that will have an impact on wolf mobility. So besides this, this Highway 2 intervention has focused a lot in terms of wolf habitat on 2 sections in Mexico. One of them, this is Highway 2, and this is another highway in the region. This one is where we've gotten the transportation authority to acknowledge that wildlife crossings need to be built. We're still not at the point where we're happy with the designs, the location, etc. But hopefully we'll get there over the next few years. This is another highway where in the region where we've been invited to advise the contractor who's upgrading that highway in the protected area of Bavispe to design wildlife crossings. And so we've got these 2 areas that are fairly advanced in Mexico. And we're starting to put some camera traps in this additional corridor and I-10 on the New Mexico-Arizona state line, where there is a known corridor for bighorn sheep that also overlaps wolf habitat. And so, as you can see, our interventions look at the landscape level regardless of jurisdiction. What we want to make sure is that this particular corridor, the Peloncillo Mountains corridor, remains connected. It is the only contiguous mountain range from the northern Sierra Madre to the Mogollon Rim, and important not only to wolves and potentially jaguars, but also black bears and other species in the region. And this is kind of what we're promoting. In some places, major underpasses that would allow wolves to move. This is a 3D model of what we want to achieve at some point. It's mostly meant to draw attention to the issue and gather support from decision makers to build these kinds of structures. So hopefully, wolves can eventually benefit from these kinds of structures on highways on both sides of the border. That is basically what we're focusing on. We're also doing some land protection initiatives that are on probably fringe wolf habitat, but nonetheless, they might prove useful in the future, since wolves have their own idea of what habitat they like, and they don't necessarily read the literature or follow the models. So we're hoping that by protecting as much land as we can on Northwest Mexico, we will be creating a network of protected lands for all kinds of species, with a focus on carnivores, which is a lot of what our organization does, but also eventually focusing more on Mexican wolves. And that's basically it. Thanks for putting out the Sign the No Wall petition there. That's very kind of you. And I guess I'll open it to questions.